Dublin is one of Europe's oldest cities, with a history going back perhaps thousands of years. The earliest Greco-Roman maps referred to the city as Eblanopolis. The city itself was based on the confluence of two rivers, the Poddle and the Liffey. Although Dublin was obscure and relatively unknown outside of Ireland during the Roman and later periods, its history as a true city really began with the arrival of the Vikings in the 10th century, who settled on a site where the two rivers met, which the locals referred to as the Dove Linn, which translates from Irish into the Black Pool. Thus, the Scandinavians transliterated this to Difflin, and from this the modern city of Dublin took both its name and its identity, a city created by the amalgamation on both the psychic, commercial and social levels of Nordic polytheism of the gods Odin, Freya, Thor and Frigga, encountering an early Christian settlement that still venerated the ancient Irish gods and goddesses of the Dagda, the Lugh, the Bow and the Crom. Eventually this Black Pool or Dove Linn would become the central point of the city, as the Vikings would establish their administrative centre upon it, which would extend a kingdom which ruled as far as the Isle of Man and the northwest of England, and remained such for 300 years, a Viking settlement, until the arrival of the Anglo-Normans in 1169. From this period on, Dublin's multiple identity of being Irish and Viking was then supplemented by Norman and then later English, and to the point today where the city is a multi-ethnic metropolis that has never been far from either the river or the sea, where the subconscious ghosts of its pasts rise from the dark waters of both the literal and the very psychological and psychic Black Pool into the consciousness of its inhabitants, which has produced some of the world's greatest writers and other artists who have taken influence from this sometimes strange and often mysterious metropolis that itself over time evolved into a goddess known as Anna Livia. From the time of Eblanopolis to the modern city of Dublin, an untold narrative has been presented to the city and to its citizens by strange and unusual buildings and other locations in the city itself, its suburbs and its surrounding regions, which historians have generally ignored because they do not fit into the academic consensus of rational history, in the form of a lexicon of occult and secret messages passed on through everything from architectural details, street planning, cultural and artistic trends, as well as within the underlying nature of the city's inhabitants, which have been captured in the work of such writers as James Joyce and his Stream of Consciousness, Samuel Beckett and his surrealist psychomelodramas, and Bram Stoker and other Gothic horror writers inspired by the tales below, emerging from and surrounding the Dark Pool of Dublin. Several of the great architectural buildings of Dublin, constructed during the height of the British Empire's rule of the city, are little more than occult edifices and temples. For example, the impressive Customs House is a temple to the goddess Britannia, who sits atop the dome above the Customs House, looking away from Dublin and Ireland and towards London. This symbolic representation of colonialism, in that Britannia has no regard for Ireland and instead sits atop a temple constructed for the purpose of exporting the wealth of Ireland out towards Britannia's bosom. This building also represented a kind of prophecy in the decades after its construction the Great Irish Famine took hold, in which millions of Irish died or emigrated, and those who left walked past the disinterested gaze of Britannia. Dublin also has the largest Freemasonic obelisk in Europe, second only to the Washington Monument in the United States. And yet people never ask themselves, what is the purpose of these constructions? Why is there obelisks? Why are they dedicated to famous Freemasons? The Duke of Wellington, the Dublin-born greatest military leader of all time, who defeated Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo, was honoured with a giant penis. This is what these obelisks represent, and the charge of the erect penis of the Duke of Wellington is provided by the bronze friezes around the four quadrant sides, creating a great cross of sacrifice which charges the penis. The friezes are made from melted down cannons captured by Wellington's army at Waterloo, and contain within them the death energy of the dying and injured screams of the same British soldiers who were under Wellington's command. The phallus of the battlefield, represented by the phallus in stone. Until the mid-20th century, Dublin was a bastion of esoteric orders and secret societies, with names such as the Golden Dawn, the Grand Order of Irish Freemasonry, the Apollo Lodge, and so on. These groups were highly influential, especially during the period of British control, but even afterwards, their influence and power continues. In fact, to this day, many senior civil servants within the Irish government are highly involved in the Grand Order of Freemasonry, which has their headquarters literally only a few steps from government buildings. In order to distinguish what Freemasonry is, as opposed to the assumptions made about it, it is important that we discount, for the most part, previous assumptions and documents by anti-Masonic groups and individuals, as these tend to be critiques based almost exclusively on Christian fanaticism by individuals who see any kind of magical or esoteric path as akin to devil worship or Satanism. It is important that we look into the roots of Freemasonry as well as its context within Irish society in particular. The Masonic path itself, on the surface, is hardly distinguishable from any other magical or esoteric order, in that it places symbolism as the central focus of the organization and the individual's personal, spiritual, and social path. This is in direct violation of how perhaps Christians might view Freemasonry, where, say, the crucifix is the central iconography of that dogma, while in Freemasonry, the crucifix would not be seen as the embodiment of a particular individual, religious or spiritual event or understanding, but rather the crucifix would be seen in an allegorical sense. Its representation beyond the narrative connected to it would be far more powerful than what this narrative itself states. And again, this is very common with magical practice and magical ideas, and also apply to not only the crucifix but to other ancient magical symbols such as the swastika, the so-called Star of David, and also the pentagram. Within their own documents, the Freemasons tell us that the function of symbolism is to look at the world as if it was a kind of text or lexicon, which involves understanding and thinking and even speaking in the language of symbols. As its etymology suggests, a symbol is an image made up of various elements in such a way that the whole represents more than the sum of its individual parts. In the first degree initiation ritual, or what is known in Freemasonry as the entered apprentice, it is stated that here all is symbol. This statement describes the path for which the Freemasons will follow for the rest of their life as Masons. When the apprentice then goes on to say, here we learn to look at the symbolic nature of everything that exists. So in other words, everything should be seen as a metaphor. This point is constantly stressed within Freemasonic circles as it is within occult and magical circles. Generally, symbols are looked upon in regular society as merely codified languages, recognizable to members of the same group and nothing more. When in Freemasonry, as in the magical orders, a symbol annihilates the definitions and the dogma which no longer fit a changing reality. The symbols within Freemasonry accept the transitory nature of being, which is constantly in the process of becoming something else. The point is to recognize the cosmos and its true living nature, to understand that there is a plasticity to the boundaries that separate the demarcation lines within reality, and to use the Freemasons' own words to gather up what is scattered. So it's clear from this language that Freemasonry, regardless of whether they refer to themselves as a charitable organisation or a gentleman's club, is very much rooted in occult and magical ideas. These occult and magical ideas, on the surface, when applied to the early history of Freemasonry, represented a means by which the mundane realities of ordinary life could be transcended into something far more powerful, meaningful, and magical than what, say, organised religion would present, especially during the 16th and 17th century. And this is why great minds of the like of Mozart, Sir Isaac Newton, Edmund Halley, and William Stukeley, the antiquarian, were members of Masonic orders. Later, as Freemasonry grew in power and in influence, and in particular following the corruption of the Grand Orient Lodge in Paris by the very real Bavarian Illuminati, when Freemasonry was transformed from an esoteric order into something involved in politics, particularly republicanism, mercantile trading, and especially espionage, that the rot took root. Even Freemasons themselves, in their documents from the era, point out the great tragedy which befell Freemasonry following the infiltration of the Grand Orient in Paris by the Bavarian Illuminati, and subsequently all other lodges around the world from that point on, including the Irish lodges, which went from being numerous and community focused to more increasingly centralized and powerful with connections to government. Which is why the entranceway of the Irish Parliament building is so easily visible through the columns of the Grand Freemasonic Lodge of Ireland. What influenced Freemasonry within Central Europe, and in particular the French lodges, also corrupted the Irish lodges. From the magical to the pathological. The god of Freemasonry is Lucifer. Lucifer is seen as the angel of light, and the Masonic calendar begins with his expulsion from heaven. This event symbolically is also seen as the point where human beings entered upon the light, in that they became conscious with the expulsion of Lucifer and his fallen angels from heaven. The idea of Lucifer being evil is purely a Christian notion, as Freemasons and most occultists do not associate the archetype of Lucifer with being evil. Rather, they see it as a representation of free will, independent thinking, and enlightenment. The Masonic world and the beginning of the Masonic universe is known as the Anno Lucas, or the Year of Light, and also as the Year of Masonry. In the English-speaking world, Freemasons took the dates from Irish Anglican priest James Ussher. According to Ussher, 4004 BC is the date of creation, generally accepted by the various English churches and English-speaking Freemasonic lodges as the date of creation. This Masonic date adds 4,000 years to the current accepted origins of the Christian era. It is less than 3 centuries off the date given by the Jewish calendar, which in its present form dates from the 4th century BC. The Masonic year generally begins in March. In the past, the Hebrew names of the months were used by Freemasons, but this practice has now been abandoned, except for some lodges that still maintain the Scottish Rite. Irish Freemasonic lodges still adhere to the date, calculated by Ussher, of approximately 4000 BC. What makes this so interesting is that Freemasonic lodges are filled with people who are often atheists or refer to themselves as being rationalist or scientific minded. Yet here they are in the belief that the world is only 6,000 years old. You will also find that this dating is applied to ancient monuments. For example, the Neolithic monuments of Western Europe, of which Ireland and the British Isles are filled with, are never dated beyond 6,000 years old. This shows the influence that Freemasonic thought had within antiquarian movements of the 17th century. Everything was dated according to biblical time frames, and in particular the year of light, when Lucifer fell from heaven and brought free will, independent thinking, and self-autonomy to all humans. This is how the atheists and scientifically minded individuals within Irish Freemasonic circles can justify their diametric beliefs, which fly in the face of the scientific process. It is purely symbolic. In reality, they believe that consciousness developed 6,000 years ago. Therefore, this explains why pyramids and Egyptian iconography plays a central point within Freemasonic circles, along with that of Hebrew, biblical, and Mesopotamian and Babylonian ideas. These are seen as the beginning of human consciousness, when the mind developed the ability to self-reflect and see upon itself, and thereby create reality. And from this, the application of symbolism and symbols to reorder, regenerate, and reanimate that which is dead. Lucifer is the deity which represents this ability for humans to apply creativity, organization, and the laying of foundations on which to build the human intellect. Daniel O'Connell is considered one of the greatest heroes of Irish history, although his legacy has been called into question by some of the leaders of the Irish independence movement, and in particular the likes of James Connolly and others, who questioned what Daniel O'Connell's real motivations were. On the surface, he claimed to be for a free, united Ireland, but there are several cases that he worked to undermine this, both as a barrister and as a very high-ranking Freemason within the Grand Lodge of Ireland. His monument on O'Connell Street is testimony to a life spent as a Freemasonic occultist, resplendent with all manner now bullet-ridden statues from the Irish War of Independence, of 4 angels of the quadrant, and O'Connell as a Freemason standing above everybody else. The monument is also strangely adorned with un-Irish motifs, such as the Irish harp, which, contrary to many popular myths surrounding it, is not the harp of the ancient Dagda of mythology, but is in fact the silver argent of Lucifer, placed on the royal banner by none other than William of Orange, and the harp symbol itself represents the argent of British Crown Agency control in Ireland, and it is central to the O'Connell monument, along with some other interesting images such as the fasci, which is the rule of ancient Rome held by force, and also images such as serpents, Medusa faces, and other cryptic classic Freemasonic images. Despite this, Daniel O'Connell has continued to remain a hero of the Irish independence struggle. In the winter 1998 issue of Irish History magazine, a fascinating letter appeared by an individual known as David Rutland. While researching the Freemasons' Hall in London, came across a manuscript copy of the minutes of the Grand Lodge of Ireland, which has been transferred to the London Lodge. Its historical implications were both groundbreaking and completely ignored at the time, other than this one letter. Daniel O'Connell is shown as the chairman of the actual Freemasonic meeting that has on its agenda a desire to take the British side during the 1798 rebellion, in collusion with Orange lodges around the city and around Ireland. Hardly the work of a great emancipator. Even O'Connell's death was strange. His body was ritually butchered, where his heart and his true associations were sent to Rome, and the rest of his body simply dumped in Ireland. The grand banquets of the Freemasons were essentially espionage and character assassination events in order to size up or blackmail an enemy of the lodge, and to invent a scandalous rumour or other outrageous lie in order to destroy the enemy. The smear campaign, along with its dissemination, became the primary method of waging wars with one's enemies, and during these Freemasonic great banquets, the lies and scandals are invented and created. This is rooted in the revival of the Bacchanalia cults, which flourished among French aristocrats in the 17th century. Often, rumours of witchcraft and devil summoning would be created by the Masonic Lodge or secret society itself in order to keep outsiders away from these events. This would have been one of the primary events to take place within the Hellfire Club on top of Montpellier Hill in Dublin. Although, this is not to say that these events were not occult or esoteric in nature. They most certainly were, as this jester craft is rooted in bardic magic of the Druidic and later periods, being used as a means of composing a satire to wage war against one's enemies. The grand banquet of the Freemasons itself was set up and applied with military precision, using battlefield terminology which first took hold in the Grand Orient Lodge in Paris soon after the Bavarian Illuminati subterfuge of the late 1700s. These banquets are seen as being central to what the secret societies refer to as emulation workings, in order to copper fasten loyalty within the brotherhood. The term brotherhood, along with fraternity, are always associated with Freemasonic or secret society operations, or the fraternal repast, to use the vernacular within these lodges and societies themselves. The ceremonial working of these grand Masonic banquets are known as the rites of mastication, very literally a battle feast for the destruction of the lodge's enemies, and the food and drink as well as the objects on the table are treated as tools of warfare. Water is referred to as weak gunpowder, and wine as strong gunpowder, while champagne is known as sparkling or fiery gunpowder. Hard spirits, usually brandy, is called a thundering gunpowder. The glasses which these beverages are served in are known as cannons. The bread on the table is the mortar. Napkins are flags and are decorated with the lodge's insignia. The rest of the table setting is known as the equipment, that being the knives, forks, and the food itself. Before the feasting begins, magical symbols are traced on the floor in white chalk, and once the rite of mastication is performed, the symbols are wiped clean and the banquet begins. The plot to destroy the enemy of the lodge begins and ends with the feasting. The apprentices serve the food while the masters hatch the scandalous plot. Following the feast, the apprentices are then given the scandal or lie to disseminate, and then this is spoken in hushed tones around the communities in order to feed the lie into the unclean, as none members of the lodge are known. The scandal will be based on actual facts, and distorting them, out of all proportion in order to destroy the character and reputation of the individual within society, and with it his or her social standing, so that when he or she attempts to reveal any secrets or illegal membership Freemasonic lodge, the unclean will believe it to be the unworthy lies of an unscrupulous person of no integrity who has indulged in all manner of perverted sexual or other illicit behaviours. The modern idea of the smear campaign, or tabloid sensation of the modern world, has its roots in the Freemasonic rite of mastication. Prior to the Enlightenment, the idea of being respectable in society was relatively unknown, as people were taken for what they were. They were either saints or sinners, and the idea of a social standing based on respectability was almost unknown. For example, it was known that the top of the royal court in England during King Charles II was rife with all kinds of sexual and other proclivities. Yet this was taken as just how these people were. Their worst behaviour would not have raised an eyebrow in classical societies, ancient Greece and Rome, for example. It also existed among the lower classes. The idea of respectability and having a reputation to uphold, gentlemanly conduct, was almost certainly a Freemasonic invention used for social and behavioural control. The witch burnings of the 17th century being replaced with the reputation burnings by the Freemasons following the Enlightenment. The stereotype of the mincing dandies of the Georgian era is also based on the Freemasonic reputation for destruction and scandal spreading about enemies during social gatherings. When it comes to writing the history of famous figures and famous historical characters, more often than not, authors will omit or leave out the subject or the individual's connection to anything regarding secret societies, and in particular Freemasonry or any occult associations. The reason for this is twofold. If the author happens to be a Freemason himself, he will feel it imperative to not disclose this information regarding the figure in question. The other reason for this is that if the author is not a Freemason, it creates a very uncomfortable reality for mainstream academics and researchers to deal with, that individuals in the highest status of business, politics, the sciences, and the arts are actually involved in processes involving occult hocus pocus. If they do mention their Freemasonic associations, invariably they will brush them aside as social climbing efforts or just the fashion of the times. One of the most famous Dubliners with very strong Freemasonic connections is none other than the author, playwright and satirist Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde became deeply involved and an enthusiastic member of the Apollo Lodge while being a student at Trinity College in Dublin. The Apollo Lodge is one of the most powerful Freemasonic lodges not only in Dublin but also around the world, yet compared to the Grand Lodge of Ireland, they keep an extremely low profile. In fact, their original building on Tara Street in Dublin is long gone, and in its place is now a run-down and derelict 1960s office building which bears the name of the Freemasonic Lodge that once sat at this location. When one begins to explore a city, any city, aware of this hidden lexicon of symbols, words, based on esoteric seemingly meaningless or disconnected associations with pagan figures of the classical mythology, pay careful attention, as the ripples on the surface of the esoteric machinations below, where the secret societies, Freemasons, and powerfully connected individuals perform their craft, often break towards the surface in the most unusual and unexpected ways. Designed by the architect of annihilation and slaughter, Sir Edwin Lutyens, the architect who also designed the cenotaph in London to commemorate the fallen rather than the slaughtered in World War I, and also oversaw the Grand Masonic Lodge of London, the Irish National War Memorial Gardens on the western side of the city opposite the Phoenix Park obelisk is dedicated to the memory of the 50,000 Irish men who were killed fighting in British colonial wars in World War I. What makes these memorial gardens even more bizarre and sinister is that the garden's first public event took place just as World War II had begun. The irony apparently lost on all in attendance. The Irish National War Memorial is made of 4 mausoleums, essentially empty boxes for the containment of the souls of the dead, rooms filled with ghosts of young men and the occasional woman, to indulge the royal families of Europe who are all interrelated with one another at the same time. Resplendent with the usual calling cards of Masonic motifs, the memorial gardens culminate in a giant stone sarcophagus at the center of the quadrant, nestled between 2 obelisks, a psychometric repository of the dead. While the official story remains that such places as these commemorates the loss of so many young people in what is called the Great Cross of Sacrifice, the reality is they create a very sterilized view of what war and mass industrial slaughter actually is. For example, the term the fallen is much more palatable than the slaughtered. Likewise, the lack of details concerning the loss of these young people in World War I adds to this overall sterilization of war in order to guarantee a replenishing of young blood sacrificed to the same goddess Britannia who sits atop the customs house in central Dublin. Another thing that also makes the memorial gardens in Dublin interesting is that they are built on the location of where Brian Boru encamped his army on the eve of the Battle of Clontarf on the 23rd of April 1014 against the Vikings. The Irish National War Memorial Gardens is nothing more than a celebration of slaughter, sanitised and dressed up in order to remove the blame from the royal families who caused it, and to ensure that future generation of young men won't be traumatized by its pastoral gardens, so they may replenish the goddess Britannia once again. The oblong sarcophagus at the center is inscribed with no names because, ultimately, the unclean and the profane don't matter. One of the most common occultic or esoteric symbols that can be seen all over Dublin city centre is the image of a cow or an ox head, often a skull, decorating several buildings, monuments, public buildings and commercial buildings such as government offices and banks built in the Georgian and Victorian era. Although bull veneration and bull cults play an integral part in Irish mythology, and in specific the classic Irish epic The Time, which revolves around a saga concerning Queen Maeve and her attempts to kidnap a sacred bull, only to find herself coming into conflict with Cuchulainn and the warriors of Ulster. These images around Dublin of the cowheads have nothing at all to do with either Irish mythological or wider European non-classical bovine veneration. These occultic motifs are known as bucranium. They're a form of decoration common on classical architecture, going back to Roman and Greek temples. They represent a classical bull cult, which is quite different than the indigenous European mythological idea of the bull cult, as in the bucranium the animal is already dead, and its slaughter is seen as a symbolic triumph of imperialism over that of indigenous ideas. The bucranium is also related to the idea of Mithric or Hathor cults of Egypt and the wider Middle East. These are one of the most obvious and easily distinguishable occult images seen around the city of Dublin, and interestingly enough were used to adorn monuments connected with Irish struggle for independence, when in reality they signal an unconditional servitude to the old aristocratic classical world of Rome in particular. Having grown up in Dublin, I'm very aware that the city takes on a unique and somewhat ethereal character as soon as nightfall happens. The ghosts come out of the shadow of the city's landscape, and back alleyways, streets, and illuminated main boulevards possess a dreamlike, atmospheric, and haunting quality. Even today, in the 21st century, Dublin has not lost its almost mystical and strange nature as night falls. This nocturnal psychogeography of the city's streetscape inspired the likes of James Joyce, who named one part of the city as being the Night Town, where the two heroes of the book, Ulysses, cross over the river into a mystical underworld known as Monto, an area that was one of the largest red light districts in Europe. In the novel, Bloom exits a brothel and in a urine-stained alleyway beholds a vision of his dead son Rudy. This becomes a pivotal scene in the book, where Bloom is transformed from a doting and impotent husband into an almost heroic character as he adopts the young artist Stephen, who is also in the same brothel, as his prodigal son. The area known as Monto, as well as being a red light district, was also the artisan and arts and crafts quarter of the city. Many artists were born here, trained here, and including the most famous was the illustrator and stained glass artist Harry Clarke, whose haunting and disturbing images encapsulate this element of Dublin under nightfall. The early Greek mystery plays of antiquity were the first to discover that certain stage lighting and stage performances would have a magical effect on the audience and make information more easily penetrable into the consciousness of the viewer. This continued all through history, and in particular through the Freemasonic operas of Mozart, such as the Magic Flute, and the Wagnerian operas of Victorian Germany, which themselves were essentially gigantic magic rituals. Ireland was not immune to this use of theatre and magic in order to generate shifts in consciousness, as well as in the wider population as a whole. One of the most famous secret societies based in Dublin was the Golden Dawn, who included among its members the highest and influential figures of Irish society of that period. The author of Dracula, Bram Stoker, the Irish statesman and poet A.E. Russell, and of course William Butler Yeats. Here we can see his actual Golden Dawn magical implements and diaries from the National Museum of Ireland. Another member of the Golden Dawn who played a highly unlikely role in this struggle for Irish independence was the seemingly omnipotent Aleister Crowley, who, on the 3rd of July 1915, declared an Irish Republic and war against England. Crowley took an interest in Irish republicanism while he was resident in New York during the height of his occult experimentations, particularly in relation to using prostitutes and sex magic. The Great Beast 666, Crowley even designed a flag for the Irish Republic, proclaiming that the design represented Ireland as a direct link between Atlantis and Egypt. This is a recreation of the flag, according to how Crowley described its appearance. The fiery red sun and a green background also denotes the 4 of 1 cards in the Thoth Tarot deck designed by Crowley and Lady Farida Harris. Notice also that the symbolism of the dove used by Irish Republican political group Sinn Féin. The symbolism of the card represents a completion of ritual or task, now grounded upon stable foundations of a community with potential for secure future growth. 4 is also a very significant number in Irish occult traditions and mythology. The Tuatha Dé Danann possessed 4 magical items which are supposed to be brought with them from their 4 cities, and the 4 green fields in Irish esoteric language made its way into the work of the Irish poet William Butler Yeats, who wrote the play Kathleen na Houlihan, which was a mystical play written at the height of his Golden Dawn activities and ran on and off at the Abbey Theatre in Dublin since the first performance in 1902. The play centres around the idea of Ireland being an elderly goddess, the representation of Era, which regenerates herself on the blood of young men who die defending her. On the eve of the 1916 Easter Rebellion, a performance was scheduled for the Abbey Theatre with a young man named Sean Connolly, who worked as an actor in the Abbey, and his previous performance was in a play which closed the week before, and at the end of the play named Under Which Flag, Sean Connolly raised the flag of the Irish Republic and utters the lines, "Under this flag, only will I serve, under this flag, if need be, only will I die." On the following Easter Monday, 1916, Sean Connolly, a captain in the Irish Citizens' Army, led an attack on Dublin Castle, which was halted by the British troops stationed there. The group of insurgents led by Connolly then went next door into the City Hall, and as Connolly was raising the flag of the Irish Republic, a British sniper killed him. He died in real life exactly as he gave his last performance the previous week at the Abbey. He was also the first death on the Irish side during the military operations of Easter week 1916. The Abbey Theatre itself was a bastion of magicians and was even started with a donation from the Golden Dawn itself in London. Yeats for the rest of his life believed that performance of his play Kathleen na Houlihan created a magical charge in the city of Dublin, which gave the rebels the decision to mobilise rather unexpectedly on Easter Monday and led to the events which eventually freed Ireland and did indeed regenerate the dying goddess Era with the blood of young men such as Sean Connolly. Within the leafy and desirable middle-class neighbourhood of Stillorgan in South County Dublin, there exists a monument that even most Dubliners, unless they live on that side of the city, are aware of. A large obelisk, more than 100 feet high, stands over a mausoleum in an area known as Newtown Park and was built in 1727 at the instigation of a Lord Allen. Contemporary histories again brush over the possibility of any occult aspect to its construction by merely claiming that it was an aristocratic eccentric folly, or that it was implemented to provide local employment in the area at the time. Although there's absolutely zero evidence for this, it remains the main story of how Stillorgan obelisk came to be. Once again, academic historians cannot bring themselves to admit that the good and the great of past societies were superstitious, ritually based occultists for fear that they would have to accept that maybe the same leaders of society they unconditionally serve and look up to today are likewise involved in the same behaviour. The architect Edward Lovett Pearce, who designed the obelisk, took his inspiration from Roman obelisks. There were formal gardens which once surrounded the obelisk, and they've now completely disappeared. And today it stands in the middle of a rather mundane but highly desirable leafy suburb. Offset to the cardinal points, one of the main windows looks directly at Montpellier Hill's Hellfire Club in direct line of sight. The manor house and estate lands in Stillorgan, where the obelisk has been built, was originally known as the Grove. A grove is a location where ancient Irish Druids practiced their rituals, and to this day, some of the ancient place names in the area as Fairy Hill are still used. It is almost certain that along with the notorious Hellfire Club atop Montpellier Hill, which is linked in a geomantic fashion with Stillorgan obelisk, utilised the stones from a pre-existing Neolithic temple or structure which had already been present on the location to construct the 4 stone entrances to the lower chamber beneath the main obelisk itself. Why did Lord Allen feel it imperative to reuse these ancient sacred stones? Could there be some kind of psychometric charge or other phenomena held within the stones that appealed to these Georgian occultists? In 1954, during a clearing of the stones below the obelisk, a short cist or ancient grave was discovered. This contained the ritual burial of a young adult female, accompanied by a flint knife, suggesting that the young woman had been ritually sacrificed with the same weapon. What is even more strange, however, is that during the construction of the obelisk in 1727, her body and knife were almost certainly discovered by the work crew, and this was made known to Lord Allen. Yet it was decided by both the owner of the land on the grove and the architect to retain this sacrificial victim on site rather than remove the remains. Knowing what we know today about the behaviour and bizarre occult practices of these Georgian Irish aristocrats, what was their intention in building Stillorgan obelisk? Was it mere folly? Was it a symbol of their power and wealth? Or did they wish, or happen to, continue the ancient tradition of human sacrifice within their own restored grove? Over 1,000 feet above the city of Dublin, and a visible landmark on the skyline which millions of Dubliners have lived under its shadow, is the notorious Hellfire Club atop Montpellier Hill on the outskirts of the city. The location made world headlines in 2016 when archaeologists began unearthing a once massive 5,000-year-old megalithic temple, which was located on the site before the construction of the Hellfire Club itself, and, as we have seen with the Stillorgan obelisk, reused the stones from the ancient temple in order to build their new occultic edifice. Built by the same circle of powerful Irish aristocrats and originally believed to be a hunting lodge belonging to the powerful statesman William Conley, who incidentally purchased it from Philip, Duke of Wharton, the founder of the original Hellfire Club in London in 1719. The building's reputation was ominous from the start. Even before Connolly took control of it, locals believed it to be cursed as the structure was constructed using the stones of the ancient temple already on the location. The architect who designed the building was the same Edward Lovett Pearce, who seems to have a thing for reusing stones from what were known as Druid temples, as he had done so at Stillorgan obelisk. At the Hellfire Club, a former standing stone was used as a supporting lintel for the main fireplace as the ritual fire of the club. No sooner had the building been finished when a mighty storm, which some believe was the work of the fairies or the Sidhe living on the mountain, taking revenge for the destruction of their ancient home. This destroyed the original roof. Again, more stones from the pre-existing ancient site were used once again to create the strange stone roof seen today, and which turned the Hellfire Club into a structure completely composed of Druids' stones. Soon after its construction, the building fell quickly into neglect as a mountain lodge, as guests seldom wanted to stay there. This is when things became very strange indeed, and certainly occultic. The Earl of Ross, Richard Parsons, and a James Worsdale formed the Dublin Hellfire Club proper. All original 5 members of the Hellfire Club can be seen in here, in this group portrait now hanging in the National Gallery of Ireland. Aristocrats with notorious reputations ranging from sexual depravity, involvement with black magic, and even court convictions for murder. The group initially began their rituals at a tavern near Dublin Castle. These involved drinking a concoction made from butter and whiskey and sacrificing black cats during these drunken rampages. As their reputation grew, and in order to move their rituals out of the sight of the Dublin public, they rented the Hellfire Club on top of Montpellier Hill, far from prying eyes. Because of the remoteness of the location at the time, mainstream historians, again going to great lengths to protect the aristocrats and politicians of the past, whom they see as heroic and infallible figures, incapable of wrongdoing, let alone black magic rituals and sacrifice, claim that this remoteness is the proof of the notorious happenings at the Hellfire Club to be nothing more than the wild fantasies of the local remote mountain communities. Yet the same historians brush aside the fact that occultic rituals of the Hellfire Club were well documented while it was located in Dublin city centre, along with the conviction for murder by some of the members. These academics and mainstream historians then come to the rather odd conclusion that the Hellfire Club became a bastion of respectable gentlemen and moral behaviour when no one was able to witness their activities. One of the most famous instances involved the summoning of the devil who joined the gentleman occultists for a card game. Another time, a priest came in to interrupt the ritual and prevented a black cat from being sacrificed. During the ensuing chaos, a demon manifested and ran off into the woods behind the building. Another constant is the mention of the ritual sacrifice of dwarfs by the group. Although, if history tells us anything about the preferred sacrificial victims of aristocrats, these were probably young children and almost certainly young girls. The original Hellfire Club came to an end when one of the aristocrats covered a servant in brandy and set him on fire. The interior of the building soon went up in flames as the unfortunate man ran around flailing his arms in agony and terror as the aristocrats laughed at his predicament until they themselves had to evacuate the building as the fire spread. This incident became so well spoken about that the Hellfire Club quickly disbanded and returned to their respective existences of gentlemen and leaders of society and politics. The final ritual was performed in 1849 when the roof was covered in oil and pitch and set alight to welcome Queen Victoria on her visit to Dublin. The burning roof could be seen from all over Dublin and into several other neighbouring counties. Royalty and the occult arts are never far from one another. But the curse of the Hellfire Club has not ended, and to this day the location is still synonymous with cults, serial killers and other strange events. And for someone to wander up there at night it can be a dangerous prospect. Even today, newspaper reports of individuals being literally summoned by the Hellfire Club's ancient stones to awaken from their sleep and make the journey to the top of Montpellier Hill are still carried in the local media. The Hellfire Club to this day stands over the city of the Black Pool, a reminder that a parallel universe of occultic conventions, rituals, and strange happenstance has always been a constant with this fair city of Dublin, and always will be.